Thank you. Thank you. I can't tell you how glad I am to be here in Yorba Linda at the Richard Nixon Library again. I must also share with you that the option from Fox News was Fallujah, so I want to talk with you about American heroes, not just the book, but the people that the book is about. But I want to share something with you about the man who was just here and my admiration for him. I first met John in 1984 when President Nixon was invited by President Reagan to be, among all of the former presidents, they were all invited to testify before what was called the National Bipartisan Commission on Central America. I was a young major at the time working at the National Security Council staff, and this requirement was levied upon me, and I dutifully saluted William Clark, the National Security Advisor, and he said, "Set it up." And so working with Dr. Kissinger and many of the people who had served under President Nixon, we went about traveling all over Central and Latin America and arranging for all of the former presidents to testify before the commission. Without getting too personal in it, one former president simply said, "Go ahead and just write whatever it is you want me to say, fly out to Aspen, get me and bring me back, and I'll say it." And so I did. And President Ford was right on the mark. His successor, who shall otherwise remain nameless, when I called him up in Plains, Georgia, said, "I don't want anything you've got. I've got my own sources." And he came up with 38 pages handwritten on a yellow legal tablet and put the entire commission to sleep in 15 minutes. The run-up to President Nixon coming was remarkably different. I first talked to John, and for several weeks we communicated with one another the things that President Nixon wanted. It required us to set up a secure skiff at his office in New Jersey, and John and I became regular communicants. Now that he's Father John, I suppose that's an appropriate word. Regular communicants about the issue of I'm sending a White House courier with a locked bag full of classified material. And President Nixon was a voracious reader. And at one point, Director Casey of the Central Intelligence Agency says, "I'm producing more stuff for him than I am for this president." We literally sent couriers back and forth between Washington and New Jersey on a regular basis leading up to the president's testimony before the commission. And on one occasion, I sent up a summary of all of the attachments from the Treasury Department, Commerce, the CIA, Defense Department, State Department, all of what was provided as input about the current situation. And President Nixon called me up, and by then he was calling me regularly and saying, "I want this, I want that," and I would get it. And he called me up and he said, "Oliver," he said, I received that package you sent up this morning, and I appreciate all those attachments. Who prepared the summary sheet?" I'm sitting at my desk on the third floor of the old executive office building. I said, "Well, sir, I did." He said, "Wow, it's too bad. It's a piece of crap." We got to be, even after his testimony, by the way, when he arrived, he refused to take a White House plane. We were prepared to send an Air Force II airplane up to pick him up. He said, "No, I'll fly down on the Eastern Shuttle." John remembers this. The Secret Service at our end was ballistic and said, "North, if anything happens, it's your fault." And so one of the modifications to what President Nixon wanted, which was to simply walk through National Airport, I think coming out of Newark, if I'm correct, John, he was going to fly on the regular Eastern Shuttle, one of his own privately provided security people, no Secret Service, but they did coordinate. And I did arrange to have the Secret Service drive a blue sedan with one Suburban, not four, no red lights, no blue lights. And we came to the gate to pick him up, and I met him as they opened the door of the airplane, and I was in uniform, so he'd recognize a Marine. Hadn't seen each other to that point. And he said, "Why are you here?" I said, "Well, sir, we're going to go down the back way." And he gave me a look. He said, "Okay." Just, "All right." He sat before the commission, and he looked at his watch, and he said, I'm going to talk for 45 minutes, and then I'll take 45 minutes of your questions, and then the major is going to take me back to the airport. He, without a note, started at the Rio Grande and worked all the way to Tierra del Fuego, knew every internal and external political and economic and security dimension for everything that was going on in every one of those countries without a note. He then took 45 minutes of their questions. And I told him later that it was the finest tutorial on foreign policy that I had ever received. It was a magnificent tour de force of a man who had absolute grasp of what was going on. The last story about President Nixon before we move on. There was a long, hot summer in 1987 that I was invited, well, actually, I was subpoenaed. I was invited to go chat with some members of Congress in Washington in July of '87. And we came home from that first day of the hearings, and it was a long day. The security agents had picked us up at about 4 in the morning. We had federal security agents that lived with me and my family to protect us from the terrorists that tried to kill them. And I was, of course, always gone when things bad happened. My wife got caught in a hurricane down in South Carolina one day when I was coming back from Iraq, and I called up all the numbers I had for her. I'd been gone a month or so. And I finally got her on the cell phone. I said, where are you? She said, I'm on my way to Camden, which is further up away from the coast. I said, why? She said, because it's a mass evacuation of the coast. And as usual, Mr. Hero, you're not here. I wasn't there the night they tried to kill the wife and kids, and the FBI came and saved them, and they moved us down. They were still living it with us when the hearings began. And so they brought us to the hearing rooms, and that brought us home late that night. About 11 o'clock at night, we got in the kitchen, the phone rang, and it was President Nixon. I just want to congratulate you on a wonderful presentation today. And it had the additional merit of being the truth. I said, Mr. President, how did you get our unlisted phone number? He said, Oliver, I know the number of the White House operator. A magnificent sense of humor and a great sense of compassion. And I know from experiences of those who served in his administration, particularly those in uniform, that he had that for those who served in the armed forces. And it is today my great blessing, and I mean it that way, that my only beat at Fox News is to cover soldiers, sailors, airmen, guardsmen, and Marines. I'm asked by our contemporaries today, what is it you really do at Fox News? I said, my job is to hang around with heroes. And a hero is not a person who wears a spandex suit and a cape. A hero isn't a person who catches a pass in an end zone or sets some new athletic record or climbs a mountain single-handedly. A hero is a person who puts themselves at risk for the benefit of another. That's the heroes that we've got serving, and their families who've sacrificed so much on behalf of our country. My colleagues, that's what we call each other in the news business, my colleagues often ask me if I've learned anything about journalism yet. Actually, the normal way they put it is, have you learned anything yet? Yeah, I've learned that, for example, there's parallels between the military and the media. They both take casualties. Usually in the media, it's when they fall off their egos and land on their IQs, but it's, you know. One of the things about the military and one of the things about the media is you rely on feedback. Feedback is very important. We get it in terms of ratings. We get it nowadays instantaneously. We get it even in the field. We have these remarkable satellite transponders about the size of a laptop that we take with us, and we can power them from solar cells or from plug it into a tank or a Humvee, and we can be up on the air from the Hindu Kush or Somalia or Djibouti or anywhere in Iraq, literally in seconds with New York or Washington. And I was on a rooftop in Iraq, I just covered a gunfight that day, and I try never to go on the air. The thousands of interviews that I've done over there and a dozen trips embedded with American forces, that's all we do. We don't go unilateral. My team only goes out to cover Americans. We've interviewed thousands of young Americans ever since We went to Afghanistan the first time in 2001. And I'm on a rooftop in Iraq, and I've got my satellite transponder, and it's a night lens because it's 4 in the morning out there and 9 p.m. Eastern, and I'm on Hannity and Combs. And it's my camera that got the gunfight that day, but the young guy standing next to me is one of the people who was in it, the eyewitness participants of that gunfight. And I described it to Combs, who often doesn't get it. Nice guy, but always wrong. I had described it to Combs, and I'd said something to the effect that, look, Combs, you don't understand. Ground combat is the worst experience any human can have. And immediately comes across in the discussion an email from one of our viewers. I actually printed it out because it popped up as we're going off the live hit, as we call it. And I brought it with me because it's a local person from just down the coast here that sent it to me. Colonel North, correction, please. Just a few moments ago on Hannity and Combs, you said, quote, ground combat is the worst experience any human can have. This is not true. The worst experience any human can have is spending time with my mother-in-law. My best friend spent 2 years in Iraq and a tour of duty in Afghanistan. He lost his right hand in Fallujah. He's met my mother-in-law. I just called him. He agrees with me, says it's not even a close call. Jim in San Diego. Now, I actually did this on television the other night. You rolling? Ready? I did this. I'm standing. I said, this book about American heroes, and the cameraman. See the cameraman back there? The cameraman is going like this, which normally means wrap it up. We've got to go to a break, a hard break, a commercial break. And I'm going, so I cut it off real quickly, and he goes, man, is this guy dense? He's, oh, you meant turn the book over. That's feedback that sometimes the recipient just doesn't get, right? There's another form of feedback, and that's, one of the great opportunities we have is we carry satellite telephones with us that work anywhere in the world. And so before I do an interview with a young soldier, a Marine, sailor, airman, guardsman who's going to be on the air, I tell him to call home, and you can't say where you are, often if it's special operations units or anything like that. Sometimes we have to shoot them from a certain angle so their faces don't show. But call home and just say, you're going to be on television. Just turn on such and such a show. Don't say where you are, and we'll have fed the tape of that engagement that they were involved in. We, on one of them, had the guy call home, did the interview, but because he was a Navy SEAL, we had to shoot him from the back of his head. And so the camera's mostly on me, but it's the two of us in the shot, and the gunfight, the engagement had taken place. And right afterwards, I said, here, call your wife and see what she thinks. And she gets on the phone and she says, what is wrong with those Fox News people? Don't they even know how to set up a camera? All I could see was your left ear. And so, just chews me out through him. So afterwards, I said, I'm just curious. He's a Navy chief. I said, and I had first met him in Afghanistan, and now he's off. In fact, this was in the Philippines. He's back home now, so I can say it. And he's out there chasing Abu Sayyaf, which is one of the radical Islamic terror groups in that part of the world. And I said to him, Chief, I've got a question. Does your wife know what you really do for a living? He said, well, in round numbers. Another rooftop shot just before Christmas last year. I'm somehow on the Christmas rotation. And we gave up 15 Christmases together, just like, you know what it's like. You're a Marine and you go. And we'd given up 15 Christmases together, Betsy and I, in my 20-some-odd years in the Marines and some thereafter. And so I try very hard to be home for Christmas. It's the 22nd of December. I'm on a rooftop in Iraq with a young soldier who I know is not going to be home. He's going to be out there for 6 more months. And so I'd said to him beforehand, at the back end of our interview on Hannity and Combs, I want you to look at that little red light on top of the camera, and I'll ask you if there's anybody that you want to say hi to. And so we get to the end of the interview, and we've run the gunfight tape from that day. And he says, is there anybody you want to say hi to? And I hold the mic over to him. He said, yeah, I want to say Merry Christmas to my wife, Sue, and my son, Johnny, and our daughter, Jane. I'm sorry I'm not going to be home for Christmas with you. Please keep me in your prayers. Merry Christmas. I'm choked up because, this is pretty moving for me. And we go dark on the satellite, and immediately my satellite telephone rings, and I look at it. It's my home number. Betsy's calling to tell me what a great interview this was. Punched a little button, hold the phone up, and she said, "Did you just say you weren't going to be home for Christmas?" Which, by the way, proves something. Everybody watches television, they don't listen to it. This is not a husband-wife thing. And before I could get another word in, she said, "Let me just remind you, mister, when you left here, you promised you were going to be home for Christmas, and you left in November before Thanksgiving. So let me just tell you this way. If you don't make it home for Christmas, leave me here with 11 grandchildren, you might as well stay in Iraq because you'll be a lot safer there than this kitchen." For a lot of these young Americans, that's the way it is. And the unfortunate part of it is, too many of my colleagues in the mainstream media do not understand who they are or what they are. And so when I came back from my 9th or 10th trip over there, my boss calls me into the office to thank me for the work that my team had done out there. It's me and a cameraman and sometimes a producer, sometimes just two of us. And we're out there for weeks on end living with these guys, and he's very kind about it. And he said to me, "I want you to do a book that documents what you've covered and get it out in time for the 5th anniversary of this war. And I want it to reflect what they've done, who it is that's done it, and how well it's going." Use their words. "Let this be the first draft of the history of this war." And so that's what we have in 364 photographs, many of them frame grabs, taken from the hundreds of miles of footage that we've shot, the thousands of interviews that we've done, and put it in between two pieces of cardboard and called it American Heroes. That's what this book is about. It's not about Ollie North. It's about these remarkable young Americans that rarely get the kind of credit or attention that they deserved. In fact, from America's political and media elites, it's most often distorted. I'll just go through a couple of things that have been said about them over the course of the last several months. We had Stephen King just last week describe them in terms that are despicable, describing them as people very much like former presidential candidate John Kerry, as people who don't have a very good education. Jim McDermott, a congressman from north of here in Seattle, described them as murderous mercenaries. We've had Abu Ghraib beaten like a rented mule for 4.5 years, to the point when I'm sent out by Fox to go talk to college students or high school students. That's the first name. When he says somebody, give me a name of a place in Iraq. They don't mention Ramadi, which was once the bloodiest city on the planet and is today safer than Philadelphia. They don't mention Baghdad. They mention Abu Ghraib. Why? Because Abu Ghraib was beaten routinely, as I say, like a rented mule. I was there in Iraq when Newsweek ran a phony story, completely fiction, about a Quran being flushed down a toilet in Guantanamo. It was repeated from mosques on a Friday afternoon from prayers, and I watched the riots take place as thousands of young Iraqi males incited to jihad raced out to kill anything they could. And they killed Americans, but 50-1 they killed fellow Muslims. I've seen the New York Times, in the person of a Pulitzer Prize winner named Chris Hedges, describe them, and I quote, Lord knows why he picked these places, "Nothing but poor kids from Mississippi, Texas, and Alabama who couldn't get a decent job or health insurance, so they joined the military, because that's all we offered them." Dead wrong. Today's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard, and our National Guard are the brightest, best educated, best trained, led, and equipped military any nation has ever had in history. Average age is 20 which makes them about 3 years older than the average age of their grandparents who might have fought in World War II or Korea. Every one of them is a volunteer. High school graduate minimum, no drug record, no juvenile record, and average education, 13 and a half years. I was in Columbus, Ohio last weekend, and there's a United States Army Sergeant First Class and a United States Army Staff Sergeant in uniform, and we're standing in a book line. I said, "How are you doing?" He said, "We're the recruiters out here." It's a tough recruiting environment. He said, "We're doing okay. We're going to ship 14 brand new infantrymen to Fort Benning this month. All high school graduates, going to finish high school in May, and they're going to go to," he said, 12 of them are associate degrees from two-year colleges, but they're enlisting in the Army. I said, "Well, what about the other 2? He said, "They're graduates of Ohio State." The special ops unit that I was with, and I saw, it's now back, and I saw them yesterday in South Carolina, and another group of them in Tennessee, had just come back. They'd fought in Basra here just a few weeks ago when President Maliki had sent his army to crush the Shia militias, and you have to remember he's a Shia, not a Sunni. He'd already done al-Qaeda in pretty much, and they got the al-Qaeda kingpin again before the next one can be picked by Osama bin Laden or by somebody out there. And I said, "Tell me about Master Sergeant so-and-so. How is he?" He said, "Well, he's probably going to retire this year and go teach in college." I said, "Remind me again, what's his background?" He says, "Well, he's got a master's degree in engineering. He's a master sergeant in the United States Army. The gunnery sergeant aboard the helicopter you see that we got shot down in had a master's degree. The gunnery sergeant with a Silver Star in the battle for Baghdad in April had a master's degree." That's the kind of people we have serving in our armed forces, and they're depicted as anything but by my colleagues in the so-called mainstream media and far too many of our politicians. I got away with asking this question. How many of you raised a teenage boy? I got caught. Betsy was actually in the room once when I did this, and I put my hand up too. She said, "You did not, I did that." You think about trying to get a teenage boy to get up at 0400 in the morning, make his own bed, go down and fix his own meals and those for several other people, clean up everything in the entire house, go off and spend 12 hours wearing a 50-pound flak jacket, an 8-pound helmet, operate the most sophisticated weapons and equipment in the world, and come back, and by the way, it was 120 degrees while he was doing it all day, and come back and do the whole thing all over again. And you don't need a size 10 on the backside to make them do it. They are self-starters. They are the brightest, best-educated military we have ever had. They understand responsibility, they understand commitment, they understand accountability better than any military force in the world. They've already had more responsibility for the lives and safety of others than they will have the rest of their lives. And yet, because of the negative media, because of the effort to make victims out of them, and there is such a thing as PTSD, as I wrote in this book, but the effort to make everybody look like they're suffering from, I don't know if this guy's going to crack up on me today, I can't hire him. The unemployment rate nationally is 5.2%. The unemployment rate for veterans of this war is nearly 20%, and that is unconscionable. 225,000 young Americans who've served their country in harm's way in some of the most difficult and dangerous circumstances you can imagine are going to complete their obligated service. They'll have a DD-214, many of them with Purple Hearts, and they'll walk out and look for a good job and they won't be able to find it. And that should not happen in this country. Thankfully, there are people in Congress and both parties now considering improvements to GI Bill educational opportunities, but these guys are already well educated. When my dad went off to war in World War II, there were 16.5 million men and women in uniform in America. And it was said by my friend Tom Brokaw, who wrote a wonderful book about them called The Greatest Generation, and I believe it was. For those of you who've seen that book, the cover of it's got the legs of a soldier with a sea bag and a woman with beautiful legs. And I said to him, it could be my mom and dad because she had great legs and he was a soldier. It said in that book, and it said elsewhere, that Every American knew the name of someone serving in the armed forces. It might not have been a family member, it might have been the kid next door, but everybody knew the name. The population of the country was about 200 million. And today the population of America is over 300 million. We have fewer than 2 million serving in the armed forces, and only 2 or 3% of the American people know the name of someone serving. The only copy of my dad's citation for the Silver Star in World War II came from a Philadelphia newspaper where his parents lived. And today you won't find a Silver Star citation in a newspaper in America. I put those that I was with when they received them, when they actually not received them, but did the action for which they would eventually receive a Silver Star, a Navy Cross, or the Medal of Honor in this book. Try this. Ask any young person the name of a rock star. They can pop one right out to you. Ask anybody the name of somebody famous in the media or Hollywood or even politics, and they'll pop out a name just like that. Ask them the name of a Medal of Honor recipient. There are 4 from this war, and no one will know the name. It's a tragedy. And what it does is it dismays those who serve and disaffects those who might otherwise serve. I get asked all the time, what would be the motive for doing that? And I said, I don't know what's going on in someone else's heart. I don't know what's going on in mine. I confess to a bias. I hate war. We all ought to hate war. Anybody who's really been to a war certainly ought to hate war, and I've been to a lot of them. I've had people die in my arms. And I hate war, but I don't hate the warriors. My bias is to let them tell their story. My bias is toward their allowing others to hear what they do and how they do it. And hopefully the end result of this book and the images that are in it will be that Americans understand who it is that's out there defending us against the most brutal adversary we have ever faced. Who it is that's out there that put their lives on the line. They put their families on hold. They make enormous personal sacrifices. It's practically biblical to see the sense of self-sacrifice, the sense of commitment, the courage, and the compassion. When you stop by to see the book, you'll see on the back cover a photograph taken by me on the 6th of April, 2003. By the way, the Staff Sergeant, United States Army, who was on the front of this book, was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, when I was there earlier this week. One of the reporters that we'd sent the book to do a little review of the book, and obviously this, if you write a book and it's great but nobody reads it, doesn't matter. It's like the tree falls in the forest thing, right? And one of the reporters said to me, that's a very intimidating cover. And I said to her, lady, trying to be gentle, lady, when you're laying on your gut and someone is trying to kill you by shooting at you, that's exactly what you want to see coming toward you. That's a Staff Sergeant in the United States Army, and he was there at Fort Bragg, now back here in the States. The cover on the back was taken on the 6th of April, 2003, when we were on the way to Baghdad. The smoke pall you see in the background is Baghdad. We're about 15 miles south of the city. The Marine unit with which I was embedded has been engaged by a Republican Guards regiment. The United States Navy corpsman in that photograph has rushed out on the battlefield and saved the lives of 2 Marines. He's bandaged them up in the middle of a crossfire, carried them on his back to the helicopter, and then he comes with the 3rd one. Meanwhile, a Reuters news crew, which had been coming up the road behind us, comes forward to find out why everything stopped behind us, because this is the lead element of a Marine division headed to Baghdad. And the Reuters news crew sets up just to the right as you look at this picture. And as the corpsman comes forward with this guy, you'll notice he's already got U.S. Marine battle dressings on him. Navy medical corpsman saved his life on the battlefield in a crossfire. He carries him to the helicopter, and this guy is treated exactly the same way the Marines were that he'd already carried. Except they pat him down first. Because you notice, that's not a Marine, that's an Iraqi soldier. He's just saved his life. You talk about compassion, the ultimate in compassion, to risk your life to save someone who is trying to kill you. And this corpsman has just done it. And as he staggers back off the helicopter to go back into the gunfight, the Reuters news crew shouts out to him, "Hey, mate, what did you do that for? Didn't you notice that was an Iraqi?" In other words, you stupid American. And because this is polite company, I can only put it this way. The corpsman gives the other crew a gesture. John, you need to talk to these people. They understand what I was saying. Gives them a gesture with one hand and shouts out, "Didn't you notice he was wounded?" That's what we do. We're Americans. One final story. There's a lot of guys that I was with that were wounded, and some that were killed, who were in this book. One of the stories in there is about a young Marine, a combat cameraman by the name of Aaron Mankin. Aaron Mankin was basically at a combat base, and my cameraman is so good at what he does. Aaron wanted to learn more about how to use that particular kind of camera. And so he asked to come along with us, and the commanding general of the expeditionary force okayed it. We flew out to Al-Qaim along the Syrian border, and we were riding in an armored vehicle, and it stopped while they cordoned off a village to search it for the Al-Qaeda rat line that comes in from Syria, and Syria is like out the window, that close. And as I walked back from the LVT, the armored vehicle, Aaron stayed aboard for a minute because they weren't going to move it far. They just needed to get it in a better position in case there was an engagement. They put up the ramp of the vehicle, and it backed up, and it ran over an improvised explosive device that literally blew it in two. It killed 9 instantly and wounded everybody aboard horrifically, burned terribly. Aaron Mankin miraculously survived that. He inhaled fire, 75% of his body covered with burns. The only part that wasn't was where the flak jacket and the helmet were, and thankfully his ballistic glasses. He's medevaced by a U.S. Army H-60 with a remarkable Army medic aboard that saved his life. Got him all the way back and put him on a plane to Landstuhl, and they fly him directly to Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas, about a mile from where I was born in 1943. The finest burn center in the world. And they saved his life. I went back to see him, and I got home in November, was home for Christmas, and then went back out. But while I was home, I tried to get around to see all the guys I was with that had been hurt, or see their families of those who've been killed. And I went to Brooke Army Medical Center to see him, and he'd been wounded in May, and here it is November, and he's much improved. He's going to live. He's had 30-some-odd surgeries, but he's deeply concerned that his fiancée, who's now coming back, she's also a public affairs type in the Marines, she'd never seen him, and he told me, Diana doesn't know what I look like. I'm afraid when she comes to see me, she's not going to want to marry me. I had not met Diana, but I'd sure heard a lot about her, because when you spend all that much time with these youngsters, you hear their stories, you listen to them. And I said, if Diana is the person you've described to me, it's not going to be a problem for her. Well, Diana came back literally at Christmas. They'd planned to marry in June when she completed her obligated service in the Marines. She walks into his room. He's terribly disfigured. He has no nose, he has no lips, he has no ears. The grafts for skin from all over his body. He's still raspy because his vocal cords and his bronchi are burned from inhaling fire. And she says, "Mankin, get your sorry butt out of the sack. Come on down. The chaplain and I have already talked. We're getting married today." They now have a beautiful daughter, and somehow or another, Diana's pregnant again. I saw them just a few weeks ago. On the eve of this book coming out, this is what Aaron Mankin told me. He said, "I went to a restaurant, and I saw a young person eating with his mother. The child said in a voice that I could hear, quote, 'Look, Mommy, a monster.' The child's mother, instead of whisking her son away, got down on a knee, looked her son in the eyes and said, 'No, honey, that's not a monster. That's a very brave man who is badly hurt protecting you and me. You need to go over and thank him.' And with trepidation, as you can only imagine, the young child walked over, reached out his hand, and took his gloved hand, because he has to wear these special gloves to keep the skin hydrated, and said, 'Thank you.' Now, Aaron Mankin will tell you that as long as there are people like that, he can endure another 30 operations. I will tell you, as long as America has mothers like that, who understand the sacrifice of young Americans like Aaron Mankin, this country will continue to be the home of the brave and the land of the free. I hope you're that kind of American. Thank you very much for being here. I'll bet that doesn't happen in church.
If I may, as our question period is about to begin, may I first introduce three of our board members. Hubert Perry, Stan Hubert, to be properly recognized. Who's currently past president of the colleges. Our secretary treasurer, John Barr. And to ask our first question, our chairman, Chris Elfman.
First of all, thank you for all you do. Thank you for sharing your stories. Can you tell us what those of us who enjoy the benefits of these young people, what can we do? If you had one bit of advice, what do we do on a regular basis to show our appreciation?
Well, I would certainly, I've lost mine now too. I would certainly, is it either any of these mics? Can you all hear me in the back? I've lost my mic too, John, so if you can do something about that while you're out there, please. What can you do? Three things. Number one, I was very sincere about hiring a vet. I mean, if you've got a good job open, now you're not allowed, I mean, I know all about EEO laws and all that stuff. You can't say vets only need apply. But you can say, I'm looking for a veteran. And you can look at their DD 214 and see that they are. So if you've got a good job and you want somebody who understands responsibility and accountability and commitment and loyalty and integrity, you couldn't do better than these guys. That's number one. Number two, I was on a flight. I'm going to set this thing down because it's probably making more noise. Can you all hear me in the back now? Okay. No. All right. Can you hear me now? Huh? All right. Hello. Hello. Oh, I hate being pinned behind a podium. That was your mic, wasn't it? I'm sorry. I just battered your ears. Forgive me. The second thing you can do is do what was done the other day. I was on a flight out of DFW, and there were 12 National Guardsmen coming home for leave, and the flight was full. And American Airlines at DFW were trying to get to Oklahoma, and I was shooting an episode of War Stories, some interviews for War Stories, and the American was trying to make these guys, get these guys seats. And so the pilot came on, the plane is full, and the pilot came on and said, look, we've got 12 young Americans coming back. I know we've already asked for volunteers to leave, and some others had traded in their tickets for whatever they get. And he said, but this is the last flight these youngsters can take to get home to Oklahoma before noon tomorrow. That's noon Thursday or whatever. And they've only got 14 days to leave at home. Are there 12 people who will volunteer to give up their seats? And, you know, first class on those MD-80s, I think, is what, 12 seats? Well, 10 of us got up, and my producer's going nuts because he knows I've got to be in Oklahoma City. There were about 40 people who got up out of their seats. And they took 12, and thankfully not mine because my producer was going to go crazy because he'd be there and I wouldn't be. And when they got aboard, the entire plane got to their feet. And I'm just saying thank you. So that's number two. And the third one is, and I'm not saying this just because John is Father John to me now. I'm saying this because I really believe. Did I screw you up? Sorry. That's the sound guy. And I just messed up his microphone. I'm sorry. Don't hit me. Old man. The third thing is pray. And tell them you're praying for them. You know, see them in an airport. If you can find, you go to the VA hospital in Riverside, and just tell them, I'm praying for you guys. And not enough Americans do that. I mean, in the aftermath of World War II, that was done routinely. And it's just not done anymore. But those three things are important. Hire a vet, thank them, and pray for them. There was a hand in the back. John, I've lost you. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Colonel North. Thank you for all your comments. I wanted to know what your suggestion would be to tell our young people, to convince them to not vote for Obama because he's for a change, so to speak.
Well, yeah, you know, I get, and obviously the war is going to be an issue in this November's election. And let me just make it personal again. In all of my many trips out there and the long time that I've spent, there's only one politician, actually two. I've seen two politicians go to places where others won't go, in Afghanistan and Iraq. In Ramadi, Iraq, the only people who could ever go there from basically 2004 through 2006 were heavily armed U.S. Marines and soldiers and Navy SEALs. I mean, it was the bloodiest place on the planet. In fact, for 2 years, Ramadi was far bloodier than anywhere else in the world. And the only politicians I ever saw come out there were John McCain and Joe Lieberman. And I watched them come out repeatedly. And they would sit there and they would listen to young officers, young Marines. The pictures are in the book of these young, Sean McFarland, the Army Brigade commander, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Journey, the battalion commander, the young Army sergeants and Marine sergeants that led the patrols. And no one else came to Ramadi because the place was constantly being rocketed and mortar fired, landing on top of the command posts and the like. And yet they came out there and they walked through the hospital wards and they'd say, how were you wounded? And that's how they concluded that the improvised explosive devices, not some statistical analysis being done at the Pentagon, they went out to the battlefield and talked to the guys coming off the evacuation helicopters. Now, that's the kind of commander-in-chief I think they want, without saying anything to disparage the others. I know for a fact they do not want this war. They've said this to me. You know, what's amazing to work with these young people today is they know nothing about the 80s. They weren't even born yet when President Nixon was calling me up to say, really good job. I mean, they weren't even born. They don't know about it. All they know is that I was a Marine and that I got this great military show on Fox News Channel. That's it. And that I spend time out there in the weeds with them. In fact, it's gotten to be a little challenging. I will tell you, carrying a 50-pound flak jacket, wearing an 8-pound helmet, and it's 120 degrees, keeping up with them is challenging. I'm 64. We ran up the 4 flights of stairs in the middle of a gunfight in Fallujah, and I'm breathless by the time we get there. I mean, I trip on the top step, and the guy behind me is carrying 2 cans of 50 caliber ammunition, which the last time I checked weighed 35 pounds apiece, and he's not even breathing hard. I'm carrying a little tiny camera and a satellite dish, which made 5 pounds. And and the kid, as I start to pitch forward into a face plant on the roof, the kid grabs the drag strap on the back of my flak jacket and keeps me from planting my face in the concrete roof. And by now the gunfight stopped, so we missed all the footage. And the kid looks at me and says, Colonel, you okay? I'd spent about 3 weeks with him at that point. I said, yeah, thank you. He looks at me and says, Colonel, how old are you? Yeah, I tell people, never ask a question to which you don't know an answer. And so I ask him, ignoring my own advice, how old do you think I am? Kid flips down the night lens on his, they got these remarkable night vision. Flips it down and looks at me real careful. Colonel, I'll bet you're 50. And at that point, talking to a young person, the best advice I can give you, shut up. Okay, don't say another thing. And at that point I say, well, son, hubris oozing out of every pore. I'll have you know, I'm 64. And the kid goes, 64? Hell, that's older than my grandfather. Sorry, John. Yes, sir.
Colonel North, do you have any future aspirations to go into politics?
I do, but if you'll look, I want you, when you come down to get the book, all but one of my 12 books have been dedicated to the same person, okay? And that one, the one that was not was dedicated to my parents, and it was the World War II in Europe book that I signed out here a few years ago. And I dedicated that to my parents because they're the ones who endured that part of my life. And so all of my other books are devoted to Betsy, this remarkable woman that I married 40 years ago. And I've learned something. I've learned that the Secret Service cannot protect me from her. And I've learned that if I ran for the U.S. Senate in Virginia back in '94, which was a wonderful experience, but it was very close, three-way race, and lost by, what, 2% or something like that. And we've had these kinds of discussions, these kind of adult discussions that go along the following lines. If you decide to run again, tell me in the kitchen so that your blood won't stain the floor. I tell young people, never say never to something that's not immoral, and politics are not yet totally immoral. I get invited to run, but right now I'm enjoying what I do, and without any false pride in it, apparently I'm pretty good at it. And as long as I can keep up with a 19-year-old wearing a flak and helmet, I think I'll continue to try. Thank you.
Over here on the left, sir.
Yes, sir.
Do you have any opinion on the draft? Everyone should serve?
Sure. In fact, I address it in this book. There's a lot of people say the solution to the problem is the draft. There's two problems with the draft. One, you could never maintain the quality of the force you have today with a draft. We couldn't in the war in which I served. In Vietnam, we didn't draft. We did draft 5,000 Marines into the Marine Corps in Vietnam. A lot of Marines say we never drafted. We did. They didn't have to go overseas unless they volunteered to do so, and I think they all did. But you couldn't maintain the quality of the force that we have today. That's problem number one. Problem number two is what I call sexual discrimination. Our current draft law conscripts men age 18 to 39. And you could certainly fill the ranks with that. But we're filling the ranks right now. And the best barometer of troop morale has always been the re-enlistment rate. Not the new enlistment rate, but the re-enlistment rate. It's been that way since the winter of 1777-78 when Washington led a nearly defeated army into a valley in Pennsylvania. And the re-enlistment rate was minus something. Today, the re-enlistment rate in the armed forces of the United States is higher than it has ever been in history from this remarkable force that we have. The problem is that new enlistment, because the press is so negative, the Hollywood stuff is so negative, it discourages parents from saying yes to a kid who comes and asks their advice. And of course, they're discouraged by guidance counselors at schools. And the answer that I give when people say, well, draft them anyway, the law says men only. We're not going to pass a law that says we're going to draft women. It's not going to happen. 15% of the force today is women, roughly, across the board. A little lower in the Marine Corps, but the rest of the force about 15%. Couldn't do it without women. And if you tried to draft some bright young male at a law school in the East Coast, like Harvard, would file a sexual discrimination lawsuit when he got his notice saying it's unfair to draft me and not her. And it would tie it up in court for the duration of the next millennium. And so I don't think you're ever going to see, short of a thermonuclear war, I don't think you're ever going to see a draft again in this country. We're going to have to rely on good young Americans like these to serve this country and do what they have to do with this remarkably sophisticated weapons and equipment that if you're not a high school graduate, minimum, you can't even fix it, much less use it in combat. So I don't see a draft coming again. And I know there's a great leavening that occurs, that there's, for example, an extraordinary racial imbalance in the military today because you can't have a drug record, you have to be a high school graduate, and that automatically eliminates a lot of minorities in this country who don't finish high school and get involved with drugs. And so we're not, it's a lily-white military, to be blunt about it. And I know that's not necessarily what our experience has been in this country. It's always been a leavening force. The military's always been a place where the egalitarian citizen soldier came back and had a positive experience from interacting with people of different backgrounds and ethnicity. But the answer to that is do better at public education in America and do better at making sure that youngsters don't get involved with drugs so they do qualify to be part of this greatest part of this generation. All right, yes?
Colonel North, thank you for what you do. Really appreciate it. And I just want to know why we can't find Osama bin Laden, and when do you expect this war to conclude, if at all?
Great questions. I don't know where Osama bin Laden is. I mean, the guys that I cover, the Spec Ops guys that are out along the Afghan-Pakistan border are fairly well convinced he's in Pakistan. And he's probably being protected by tribal connections and family connections. One of the things that he does is he never goes anywhere that there aren't civilians. And because we have this very strict rule of engagement that says we're not going to kill civilians unnecessarily, it's very difficult, even if they target him with a UAV. People constantly refer to it as a predator, but it's much more than that. But the armed, unmanned aerial vehicles that are out there, unless they can confirm that there's no civilians around, they're not going to engage. And so my guess is that they're right. He's probably in Waziristan or over in the federally mandated tribal areas of West Pakistan. And yet, I will also tell you this. If Osama bin Laden died tomorrow, whether he fell down a flight of stairs or it was a Hellfire missile that landed on his head, it would not change the jihad. The jihad that is being waged against us is much bigger than Osama bin Laden or even Ahmadinejad in Tehran or any guy who's going to pick up the mantle in the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's, here you go. Now it's going to destroy his credibility in front of a conservative crowd. All of that will change because of one thing, that Muslim women are being protected today by Americans wearing flak jackets and helmets. Now that sounds weird, but the fact, I mean, you look at the pictures of the Muslim women walking out holding their purple fingers up after elections in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I've been there. I've watched it. I've interviewed them. I've talked to them. What does this mean to you? It means that I am now a participating member of this culture, this society, this political process, and this economy. And they don't vote to have their sons go off to become suicide terrorists. That's happening down at the mosque where they're radicalized by some radical imam. But it doesn't happen when a mom says, what I want is not for my son to learn how to die. I want my son to be given the tools to live better. And so I'm voting for better education. I'm voting to let my daughters go to school, which they couldn't before. I'm going to allow myself to have a cell phone. I can actually drive if we can ever afford one. And that's the kind of thing that's going to change that culture. That's why the radical Islamics fight so hard against it. Half their society has been for 11 centuries denied any opportunities whatsoever. That is changing. And it's Muslim women that are going to do it, and those Muslim women are being protected by American troops today. It's changing everything. And that kind of answers your question as to when more of them get to vote and participate outside of Iraq and other places, this war will be over. The war is not Iraq. The war is not Afghanistan. It is a much broader offensive that was unprovoked by us, that was launched against us. It became very visible in 2001, but it actually started back in 1979. The rest of the story is in the book. Yes?
Colonel North, on September 20th of 2001, President Bush addressed the nation, and I want to read you 2 sentences from his speech that I have here in front of me. He said at that time, "Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them." Then he went on to say, "And we will pursue nations that provide aid or safe haven to terrorism. Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorist. From this day forward, any nation that continues to harbor or support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as a hostile regime." What has happened to that policy? Why are we sitting back and watching and waiting while Iran trains and kills our Marines and our soldiers in Iraq? Why do we sit back and let all this happen when we know it's Iran that's doing it and wait for them to get the atomic bomb? Why don't we follow the policy that he said? What happened to this?
Well, let me make a couple of observations very quickly about that. Number one, that statement, as good as it was, misstates the problem because the word radical Islamic is missing from it. And that was done because of the political correctness of Washington. 2 weeks ago, the State Department sent out a directive around the government to stop referring to them as Islamic terrorists and simply refer to them as criminals. There's a wonderful axiom of war that says if you don't know your enemy, you will lose. Apparently, we don't know our enemy. That's number one. Number two, I have great affection for President Bush. He failed to mobilize this nation in the aftermath of the most devastating attack on civilians we've ever endured. He failed because in large cases, the people around him objected to the kind of rhetoric I just used. And so we rarely have we stated, in one of his State of the Union addresses, he did address it directly that way and was castigated by the so-called mainstream media for it and stopped. So if you don't know the enemy, you're going to lose. Number two, the problem is one of not just failing to mobilize Americans. It is failing to mobilize our allies to the net magnitude of the threat they face. And there's an easy explanation for it. Islam today represents about 10 to 15% of the populations of every country in the north of the Mediterranean. And they're very worried about it. Think of what happened in France 2 summers ago. And there are still sections of Paris, notwithstanding the new conservative government under Sarkozy, where Paris policemen cannot go. Same thing is happening in Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany. Same thing is happening in Great Britain. Now, it doesn't matter, apparently, that we've had suicide terrorists blow people up and kill citizens in Madrid, in London, in Bali, in Amman, all places that are supposed to be our allies, right? And people don't want to say what it really is. It is radical Islamic terror that we're confronting. And if you don't use those words to understand the nature of your enemy, we're constantly told this is not a religious war. You'll see a picture in this book of a human being stepping off a curb and literally, as the convoy of Humvees goes by, he steps off a curb and throws himself up against the Humvee right in front of me. Now, we turn our cameras on the minute we go outside a base, and they just roll. Tape is cheap, right? Tape is cheap. And if there's nothing on it, you just retape over it. This guy blows himself to pieces right in front of us. I am stunned. Now, it may not be a religious war for the Lance Corporal on top of that Humvee who was badly burned, miraculously nobody killed, because the armor really does work, notwithstanding what the New York Times or the Washington Compost would tell you. It works. And the fact is, it may not be a religious war for the Americans, but it sure as hell was a religious war for that guy who stepped off the curb. You see what I'm saying? And so, in the words of Bernard Lewis, who I quote in this book, if you don't know your enemy, you don't know who you are, you don't know what your objective is, how do you expect to win? Bernard Lewis, by the way, was Winston Churchill's Mideast advisor from 1940 to 1945. His resume, he's professor emeritus at Princeton University, and I was blessed to have him as a lecturer at the Naval Academy when I was a young midshipman. His resume says, from 1940 to 1945, I was otherwise engaged. Yeah, he was an intelligence officer for the British Army. And he says, you know, we knew who we were, we knew what had to be done, we had a leader who could mobilize and motivate us to do what had to be done, meaning Winston Churchill. And we failed on all 3 counts today. And I have great affection for President Bush, but the fact is, given the negativity of the press and the hostility of the political process, I mean, I could throw your question right back at you. How could you have 2 U.S. senators in this state like you've got who vote against it every time? So, I mean...
Colonel North, Colonel North, we have time for one more question.
Can we edit that out of the C-SPAN coverage? I'm never going to be invited to speak in Washington. Go ahead.
Going back in time a bit now, would you consider doing another book on the heroes of the Vietnam War?
It's coming. I mean, my goal is to, I mean, I've been on this job now for 7 years. We have 110 hours completed at Fox of war stories. Over 50 of them, 52 to be precise, are about World War II because we were losing those veterans so fast. I just wanted to make sure I could document what they'd done And those are true documentaries. I mean, there's no reenactments or anything like that in these shows. And they're now out on DVD. And I've done 9 hours on the Korean War, one of which will air on Memorial Day. Shameless self-promotion. And we're going to have more Vietnam coming on the 4th of July. And so, and from that I take, because these are the real thing, we'll make them books too. So count on it. Just stay around long enough to have me do them. Yeah. Thank you.